When it comes to remakes, Super Mario 64 DS is a pretty interesting example. A lot of remakes exist to show off advancements in graphics, tech, or just general game design that has progressed since the original released. 64 was one of the first major 3D platformers ever made, and naturally being the first, obviously there were still areas that could be improved upon. However, Nintendo decided to remake the game for their upcoming handheld, the DS. Remaking the game on completely new hardware, and more importantly, hardware that is used in a significantly different way. This presents a lot of new challenges that don't inherently work to fix any underlying issues present in 64. Instead, the primary reason for remaking the game for the DS rather than the GameCube or their upcoming system, the Revolution, can be found during E3 2004. This was the event where Nintendo first unveiled the DS to the general public, sporting a noticeably different design to what would launch only 6 months later. A lot of games were shown off during this press conference, including an extremely early build of New Super Mario Bros. Sporting side flips like 3D Mario games, as well as this, Super Mario 64 x 4, featuring all 4 characters using the flight cap, something that only Mario can do in the final game. But this early title and scrapped mechanic isn't the only major difference, as it seems like their original intention for this remake was a lot more ambitious. 64 x 4 was heavily marketed here and shown off primarily for its multiplayer features, something which the final game still has, but it's clearly had significantly more planned for it. The original multiplayer mode played by attendees and the press does still resemble what we got, being a simple versus mode where players compete to collect the most stars, but it's notable for the fact that they use the main 4 characters here. In the final game, you play as multicolored Yoshis with the ability to find caps to turn into the other characters. Another change visible in this demo is a floating island near the castle and a small indent on the right hand side of the castle. This indent, or black box as it's become known as, can also be seen on the game's file select, but is nowhere to be seen in the final game's castle. And because of this, the black box has led to tons of different hoaxes and urban legends, usually relating to the existence of Waluigi or whatever other nonsense people came up with back then. But in truth, there's no real concrete answer as to what this was actually there for. I've heard a couple times around the internet that it's related to the floating island, that there's a cannon in that black box you'd use to reach it, but I've seen zero evidence to support this. The only source I can find for this claim is an old Forest of Illusion tweet that mentions it, but it also clarifies that the footage has seemingly been lost, so I can't really do anything with that. Plus, it just doesn't really make sense how a cannon being there would even work, as the area is way too tiny for that, and more importantly, even if a cannon was there, it wouldn't be able to reach where the island is. So personally, I don't think a cannon was there. I think the more likely explanation is that this is where a star would have spawned in multiplayer, requiring you to get a wing cap to reach it. The floating island likely served a similar purpose, with them serving as the spawn location for stars. It is also possible that these changes represent expansions they originally had for Peach's castle. It's possible that both of these are actually related to something else that was cut from the single-player aspect of 64 x 4, which was also playable from this E3 demo. The single-player demo is notable for having a feature that was completely removed from the final game, however it isn't something that was properly filmed. GameSpot's report by Jeff Gerstmann stated that you could freely swap between all 4 playable characters during the main courses by simply tapping icons on the bottom screen. Unfortunately, no one, as far as I'm aware, has ever actually recorded themselves doing this, but there is a little more credibility to this claim, as you can see the icons Jeff mentions here, and all 4 characters spawn in when the single-player demo is selected, which only really makes sense if what Jeff is saying is true. Again though, nobody seems to have recorded this happening, and as far as I'm aware, Jeff is the only person who has ever mentioned this mechanic. It's possible that this was a feature exclusive to the E3 demo to give players the chance to try the other characters, but I think there's a little more to this. The E3 demo isn't the earliest version of 64 x 4 that we see. Going back to the B-roll Nintendo showed, we can see the build shown off here is significantly older than the one they used for the public demo, and a build similar to it also seems to be what was used for various screenshots given out at this time. Pretty much all of them showcase all 4 characters exploring levels together. One even shows all 4 characters facing Bowser together, something that only Mario is allowed to do in the final game. Although I'm not even really sure that this screenshot is like an actual real piece of gameplay. They're all just walking towards each other. There's no bombs or anything that could be used for a boss fight. They're all just like entrapped in this tiny room. Even the minimap shows that. I'm pretty sure they're all here to fight to the death. Another screenshot showcases the back of the castle, which was fully expanded at this point in development, including these 3 pipes leading to unknown destinations. The existence of these pipes seems to indicate that there are plans for more expansions and general changes to level design, at least in Peach's castle. In general, it seems like they originally had a much larger focus on the multiplayer, allowing you to play through the game in its entirety with your friends, which the final game dropped almost completely, leaving in its place a bare bones versus mode. Okay, so I said this pretty definitively when I was initially scripting and recording, so I feel like I should clarify on this point a bit more. Unlike with Sunshine, there's no one killer quote that explains what the game originally was. So this bit about the game being fully playable in multiplayer is speculation on my part based on the evidence given. Nobody who's ever worked on the game has ever stated this as a fact though, so I feel the need to clarify that this isn't something that's like confirmed, this is just a theory that I'm stating. But I do think what they originally presented, whether intentional or not, definitely gave off the impression that the game had a strong focus on multiplayer. It's undeniable the game changed a decent amount based on the early materials for it, which is important to me as it gives a lot of context for why 64DS is the way it is, which should hopefully become more apparent as this video goes on. Speaking of the final game, we haven't actually talked about that at all yet, have we? Should probably start doing that now. Releasing as the DS's headlining launch title, the final version of 64X, now retitled to 64DS, is a relatively safe remake compared to what was initially shown during E3. As multiplayer was almost entirely scrapped, the bulk of 64DS's content relies on the single-player mode. The majority of 64's original level design and missions remain intact, with most changes being related to the 3 new characters. Unlike the original, you start off as Yoshi and gradually have to unlock the 3 other characters, who each come with their own unique abilities and stats. Yoshi can do his iconic flutter jump and gobble up enemies. If you leave an enemy in your mouth for long enough, he'll automatically make an egg which you can use to chuck at enemies. Mario is Mario and he controls a little better than Yoshi and has a lot better jumping capabilities, but other than that there's not much to say about him. Luigi is a slippery little guy, which allows him to run on water and makes him the fastest swimmer. He also has access to this special spin jump that slows his descent, which he can do from a crouch. This ability seems to be inspired by something Mario was able to do in the earliest known public build for the original 64, which featured Mario doing pretty much this exact same move, only from a triple jump instead of a crouch. Wario is the slowest character in the game and also has the lowest jump, but makes up for it by being the strongest. This includes an ability which is exclusive to the Versus mode where Wario tosses around stunned characters. As far as I'm aware, this ability is only mentioned in the game's manual and there's even artwork of it in action. I assume this ability is more or less just a leftover from when 64DS had a stronger focus on multiplayer. The star count has also been increased, with DS adding 30 additional stars to collect, bumping up the total to 150. Some are obtained via new missions, typically involving collecting these silver stars or by hitting these switches which spawn a star you have to race to. There's a few new secret courses and special levels dedicated to unlocking the 3 other characters, each with their own unique boss fight and red coin missions. That's pretty much everything new to 64DS on a surface level, but there's a lot more to this game's changes that hurt the overall experience in my opinion. Let's start with something very small. 64's iconic Mario head has been changed, with it no longer allowing players to mess around with it. Instead, when you click on his face, you get this drawing and you can kinda move it around and mess with it, but it's ultimately not nearly as charming as the original Mario jump scare. It does allow you to draw whatever you want, so I mean, that's something, I guess. The removal of this would be a lot less weird to me if it wasn't for the fact that one of the tech demos for the DS was just straight up an interactable Mario head. Maybe it was just too demanding for the DS to handle properly. Either way, this is a very small nitpick, but I think it's worth noting, mainly just due to how well known the original was. Unfortunately, this is about the smallest complaint I have, as the next major issue I have with this remake has to do with the characters. While the extra variety is nice, and it does give you the potential to approach levels in different ways, these guys guys are not made equal. As mentioned before, Mario is the only character who can fight Bowser. No other character is allowed to do this, which means Mario is actually the only one who is required to beat the game. Mario is also the only character who is able to use the wing cap, despite the initial reveal showing that everyone could do it. On that note, the power-up system also works differently. Rather than unlocking caps for Mario as you play, DS has this special flower that gives different power-ups to each character. Mario can inflate and use the wing cap, Yoshi gets to spit fire, Luigi becomes invincible, and Wario turns metal. The latter two are notable as they were both things Mario could do himself in the original. So Luigi and Wario's big special ability is basically just a hand-me-down from Mario. And because of this, there are now certain missions that can only be cleared by specific characters, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but it does trip me up. The most annoying case of this was early on in my playthrough, during the 8 red coin mission in Cool Cool Mountain. For some reason, the devs decided to change this mission so that one of the coins is encased in these new ice blocks which can only be destroyed by Yoshi's fire breath. Now I think they did sorta try to mitigate this issue by leaving different caps around the levels that you can pick up to transform into other characters. Although there's nothing to transform the player into Yoshi, so if a level requires him and you didn't bring him along, you're forced to leave. Still, I do think these caps were meant to make this less annoying, but at that point, why not just make all the characters' abilities universal, allowing every character to collect every star? Why is Mario the only one who can use the wing cap? Why is Wario the only one who can turn metal? To me, these changes feel like they more so exist to force the player to use the other characters, if even just for a little bit. And while I personally find this quite annoying, it is actually smart, as outside of being forced to use someone else, there's a very clear character in this version who stands above them all. Luigi is a primordial god in 64 DS. He snaps the entire game in half, removing a good chunk of 64's platforming challenges, and it's all thanks to his float we talked about earlier. This ability is completely busted, and you can tell the final level design of 64 was never meant to have something like this, which is more than likely why it was removed for the original game. Because with it, you can make levels that were previously kinda tricky into an absolute joke. Now to be honest, I don't really mind a broken character in a game, as long as they're fun, but I would at least like the other characters to be just as fun too. Luigi being overpowered is one thing, but as long as the other characters offer something fun in return, then to me at least it should balance out a little. Unfortunately, in terms of enjoyment, none of the other characters really match. Yoshi is okay. He's notably slower than Mario or Luigi, and honestly that alone just kinda makes him feel inferior. I can see how his flutter jump can be useful, though there's not really that many areas in the game where I felt like I needed it, especially considering the crimes against humanity Luigi can commit with his spin. Another downside to Yoshi is that anytime you need to use him, you actually have to be Yoshi. As mentioned before, there's no cap for him, so anytime you want to use Yoshi, you have to walk back to the room. This is a small thing I haven't talked about, but anytime you want to switch characters, you have to enter this room and go through the respective character's door. Being forced to backtrack to use certain characters for missions is pretty annoying and hurts the overall flow of the game, especially since a lot of the ways they changed the game to make it like this are extremely arbitrary, and no character makes this more clear than Wario. Wario is awful. He's the slowest in the game, has the lowest jump height, and has the worst swimming speed, which is supposed to be balanced out by him being the strongest. But let's be honest here. Strength is like an objectively useless trait to have in a game like Super Mario 64, and pretty much every instance that you're required to use Wario feels forced because of it. All of the missions that require Wario either require him because of the metal cap or because of these big black blocks that only Wario can break. And every instance that does use these blocks feels unnecessarily obtuse. Here's a few examples of what I mean. So another new thing introduced in DS are these Mega Mushrooms, basically just a prototype for them to later appear in New Super Mario Bros. Every character in the game can use these, even Yoshi. It even replaces his tongue grab with normal punches and kicks. Overall, it functions pretty similarly to how it would eventually function in New Soup sans the original design, but they are significantly less useful here, as in truth, there's no real reason for them to be here. 64's level design never calls for them to be used, with one exception. There's one mission in Hazy Maze Cave that requires Wario. In it, you use the Mega Mushrooms to destroy the falling boulders. Now, while everyone can use the Mega Mushroom, only Wario can complete this mission because they hid the Mega Mushroom behind one of these stupid-ass Wario blocks, locking out every other character's ability to complete this for an arbitrary reason rather than creating something that actually felt unique to Wario. Another example of this comes from the level that you originally unlocked the Vanish Cap in. It's still present in 64 DS, but now serves as a standard secret level with 2 stars, one of which which requires Mario to get. It's actually a short but fairly unique addition that takes advantage of the new balloon power-up given to Mario. This is in spite of the fact that you need Wario to gain access to this level, as again, they decided to block it off with one of these stupid black bricks. Even though Wario himself serves no purpose or advantage to either star featured here. Meanwhile, Mario, the character who isn't needed to gain access, gets an actual challenge designed around him, which is especially annoying since I don't think most players' natural instinct after unlocking this level is to backtrack and switch to Mario. Luckily, they did somewhat remedy this by placing a Mario hat in the level, but at a certain point I think it's important to ask why even do it like this. It's not like inflation is a unique biological trait exclusive to Mario. The internet has made that far clearer than I ever wished to see. It actually seems like these black bricks were even more prevalent early on, as one extremely crusty trailer I found shows that at some point they plan to block off the entrance to Shifting Sandlands Pyramid using one of these blocks. Again, I don't hate the idea of being incentivized to use the other characters, but all instances of it feel forced and unnecessary, with most of it not really adding anything to the game outside of just divvying up tasks between the four characters in ways that aren't interesting or creative. And I mean, even beyond all of that, Wario is just awful to play as, with him having no advantage to using him that you'd want in a game like this. So outside of being forced to, why would I ever pick him? The only other character I haven't really talked about is, ironically, Mario himself. There's not really too much to say about him, and while he's definitely an improvement over Yoshi, he pales in comparison to the Christ-like abilities of Luigi. So once you unlock the Green Man, there's almost no reason to pick anyone else. Except for the fact that the game forces you to pick Mario, as he's the only one who can fight Bowser. So if you're currently using another character, you have to swap to Mario for all 3 Bowser levels, no matter what. Mario is also the only character who can open major star doors, because I guess the other characters are just incapable of doing this. Again, I feel the need to ask, why even bother designing the game like this? They went out of their way to alter missions so that you're required to use different characters, when I feel like everyone should just be on equal footing. It's not like there's levels in Mario 2 or 3D World that only Peach or Toad can handle. Every character has their own unique playstyle, but the base levels remain the same, and I'm not really sure why that same philosophy wasn't carried over to DS. Maybe you could argue that they wanted to do something different, and in that case, I think there's a clear reason why they never revisited this idea for a mainline Mario game. On the topic of altering levels, 64DS made some slight alterations to a few levels to make them easier. For example, in the first mission of Jolly Roger Bay, there was originally a small puzzle inside the ship, where you have to open chests in the correct order to unflood the inside. 64DS completely removes this, instead just having the player open one chest to unflood the ship. Tick-Tock Clock had an entire floor added to the bottom, making it harder to die from falling. There's a ton of other small changes, but these are just the ones that stuck out to me. These may be a plus to some people, but personally I don't think 64 itself is that hard of a game, and dumbing down portions of it doesn't really do much to make it more accessible. But in the grand scheme of this game, I think the main issue I have with all these changes is that they don't add anything to the game. They don't improve on anything 64 had, and it doesn't make a single sizable improvement. Most of the game's base level design and mission structure remains the same. They didn't do anything to fix the camera, which arguably might actually be worse in DS due to the fact that you have to control a lot of it with the touchscreen now. They didn't go out of their way to touch up any levels, which is nice in a purist sense, but even as someone who adores the original Mario 64, there are definitely levels in it that can be improved. The only real objective thing I can say that 64DS improves is the performance. Even so, 64DS just feels kinda backwards to me in a lot of its design choices. 64DS has a lot of common pitfalls that we'll be seeing a lot with these remakes, where they'll add content that ultimately doesn't add any value to the game as a whole. On paper, 64DS is a pretty neat expansion. It's a handheld port of a classic game with new content, which should be great, but nothing really added to 64DS makes me want to play this more than the original. But in all honesty, that really has to do with the one thing I haven't really talked about with this port. The thing that honestly makes this port way more divisive than the content in it. Everything I've mentioned here is small potatoes compared to 64DS's controls. As the DS has no analog stick, the primary method of control that the developers intended for 64DS was the touchscreen, with them recommending the use of this small strap that the original DS model came with. Although as far as I've seen, this strap was removed from later models like the DS Lite. With the touchscreen, you're given full analog movement, and it's what several signpost tutorials actively encourage you to use. Even Bowser prompts the player to use the touchscreen to throw him. Despite this, myself and many people who played this version at the time primarily controlled 64 64 DS with the D-pad. This is far from ideal, as 64 itself was always designed with full analog control, so limiting it to 8 directions kinda goes against the very nature of what 64 is meant to be. Clearly the devs were aware of this issue, which is why they recommend and likely expected most players to use the former to play through the game. Still, I don't know anybody who's actually played all of 64 DS using the touchscreen, with most people instead just opting to use the D-pad, and it's not unplayable by any means, but it's far from an ideal way to play a game like 64 that was so heavily designed around the concept of analog control. This is another thing I said a little too definitively at first, so I want to make a correction. Most signposts actually do prompt you to use the D-pad first, and signs that mention using the touchscreen are a lot rarer and typically prompting you to use it for more precise movement. So I think the devs more so intended for you to utilize both movement options in tandem depending on the situation, with the option to use exclusively touchscreen analog reserved for separate control schemes. So I was wrong basically, the D-pad was indeed intended, at least in part, as the default control method. Just thought it was important to correct myself before moving on. The rest of the video should make sense. Back to the video. In the modern era of modding, there have been several fan attempts to remedy this issue. They take a bit of setup, but they do work to give 64 DS full analog control, which on the surface should fix one of the biggest issues I and many others have with this version. However, this doesn't fully fix the controls as a whole. This is because 64 DS doesn't play like the N64 version, as the game's movement and physics are quite different. While DS does a very admirable job of mimicking the original, the game feel is not the same, and unfortunately DS just feels worse to play overall. Now, talking about controls in any review is pretty hard, as it's something that can't easily be explained. It's more just something you have to feel directly. There's a great video by Mr. Wellbig which explains the differences a lot better than I could, so I'd highly recommend watching it after this. But to generalize it a bit, 64 DS is just a lot more cumbersome when it comes to basic things. Stuff like side flips or even just simple actions like turning around don't feel nearly as good as they do in the original. Mid-air movement has also been given a bizarre amount of control, letting you drift to absurd degrees with basic jumps. It's actually another reason why Luigi is so useful, as his spin makes precise jumps a non-issue. Again, controls are a hard thing to speak on and they're pretty subjective, but after playing 64 DS for an extended period of time and then playing the original, to me at least, there's no contest. Original 64 controls leagues better than DS, and adding analog control in any way doesn't fix a lot of the underlying issues the game's movement has. And I don't think any of the new content added, to me at least, justifies ever playing this over the original. While I do enjoy ideas presented in 64 DS, there's nothing that really stands out above anything in the base game. As I mentioned before, when adding new content to a remake, I think it's always important to ask yourself, what value does this actually add to the game? 64 DS has more playable characters, but ultimately all it does is spread tasks around that Mario could normally complete on his own. There's 30 additional stars, which is nice, but these alone don't fix any core issues I have, nor do they really add much to the game itself. They more just feel like fluff. There is one thing that does add some meat to 64 DS, the minigames. These are unlocked via these new little white rabbits that appear in and around Peach's castle, with each character having their own unique set of minigames. And there's a ton to choose from. Honestly, when I was a dumb, stupid child, these were definitely the thing I spent the most time on. Gotta give special shout out to Wanted, Puzzle Panic, Sort and Splode, and Trampoline Terror in particular for me. There's also a bunch of gambling games, including poker, roulette, and a straight up slot machine. These were actually enough for them to remove all of the minigames from the Korean version, so sorry to anyone who grew up with that. Fun fact, by the way, these minigames were at least in part created by Motoi Okamoto, the same person who is currently in charge of the Silent Hill franchise. He's also quoted in this 2017 article stating that 64 DS had one of the most intense crunch times of any game he had worked on.
In those days, Miyamoto would come to us at 11 PM after he finished all his board member work and say, "It's Mario time." At that point, we'd start planning a meeting that would run until 2 AM. At that point, Miyamoto would go home, leaving us with the words, "You should return home soon, for your health." Over the next 2 or 3 hours, we'd write the game design documents and summarize the instructions for our artists and programmers. It was the craziest crunch time that I've ever experienced in my development career, but if the god of games was working so much, could we give up? Miyamoto had incredible stamina.
While it's never been directly confirmed, based on everything we've seen, it's safe to say Motoi's words carry a lot of truth. They probably had a lot more ideas for what they wanted this game to be that was ultimately scrapped, potentially due to this game having to launch at the same time as the DS itself. Did you know at some point they actually did plan to have a 5th playable character? And no, it wasn't Waluigi, it was actually Peach. She has several animations for jumping and running, so it seems like they had bigger plans for her, maybe as a potential reward for finishing the game. It is funny that there's a door that's only used for 1 star and never for a proper character, so maybe it's a leftover from her? Regardless, the game we ended up getting was a fairly safe remake that, to me, mostly exists as a way to test the DS hardware more than anything else. Culturally, the original 64 has definitely lived on a lot more than DS has. A big reason for that, at least to me, is that 64 is overall a better game despite its age. Even so, 64 DS has its place in history and in many people's hearts, so I'm not here to take it away from you if it's your preferred version. 64 DS, to me at least, is more of a tech demo for what the DS was going to be capable of. And even in that sense, it ultimately had to cut features from it that the DS was designed to take advantage of. Whether it be due to time or hardware restraints, that idea was completely gutted, leaving 64 DS a shell of what it was once meant to be. But even without that, I do still see why Nintendo chose this to be the DS's flagship title. Having the entirety of Super Mario 64 on a handheld device, especially in 2004, not even a full decade after 64 released, is really cool and a very strong technical showing for what would become many's entry point for the DS. But in my opinion, 64 DS misses a key element that made the original so great, and in its place is new content that doesn't do much to make this worth revisiting over the N64 version. If you've never tried it before, I'd still say it's worth giving a shot, if for nothing else than the sheer novelty of it.